Meanwhile, as world powers go back and forth, talking about the plans for peace in Syria, millions are getting caught in the crossfire, and way too many of them are children. More than 140,000 people have been killed since the Syrian conflict began. It's now about to drag into a fourth year. At least 10,000 of those killed are children. And there's no end in sight to the despair. NBC News chief medical editor Nancy Snyderman has this special report from Lebanon near the Syrian border.
The refugee camp where we find 28-year-old Miriam Jassoum is isolated, bitterly cold, and the conditions deplorable. It's the worst I've seen. She shares a small tent with her family, now 5 children, including the baby boy born yesterday.
It's a mud floor, and it's wet. There's no insulation, it's just plastic. And this is how people are living, in between their homeland and a country that is housing them, but they're still not citizens.
Her husband Yasser takes us inside the tent where we find Miriam lying on a thin, damp mattress. Lying next to her is her newborn, Leif. Miriam describes feeling cold, exhausted, and just lousy. Her husband has brought medicine prescribed by one of the doctors. There is no happy ending here. Just reminders everywhere that in this ongoing crisis, children's lives are on the line.
Over the past 48 hours, we've seen great emotional highs and lows, like the newborns in this warm nursery, and yet outside tonight, a cold, drenching rain, which reminds us of the depth of the suffering of so many of Syria's refugee children. I'm Dr. Nancy Snyderman, NBC News.
And a note, Syrian refugees at the camp there being charged $400 a year to live. Now, it might not sound like a whole lot here in the U.S., but that's an astronomical price for people who have already so little. Now, for more on this massive refugee crisis and how it's affecting kids, let me bring in Carol Stern, president of the U.S. Fund for UNICEF. I read, you were there last year. I read your blog post today on your website, and I was in tears in the newsroom reading it. And I want to throw some of the numbers here for you folks. Overwhelming, 9 million Syrians displaced, 5.5 million are kids. If this goes on too much longer, what are going to happen to these? What's going to happen possibly to these children?
We're going to have an entire lost generation if we don't respond and react really quickly. These kids are being orphaned, they're being maimed, they're being forced into soldiering, and they are bearing witness to horrific trauma. Horrific.
And I see some of the pictures here, and I was struck by the pictures I saw on the blog post about your visit. They look like kids. They look like just smiling kids, not really, I can't say they're not aware, but they looked like any kids you would see in the streets in New York.
Kids are amazing. You know, I've had the privilege to travel to over 26 developing nations in my job. And I always say that one of the things I find everywhere I go, kids are always playing with a ball. It doesn't matter where you are. Kids are kids. But at the same time, as they watch all this violence, as they're forced to participate in this violence and kept out of school, we're going to lose an entire generation.
And these are some of the pictures from your trip in particular. Another story you told that was really striking, and a lot of us, it helps give perspective here. And folks who end up in some of these refugee camps were middle-class folks who just ended up losing everything.
It was horrific to hear some of the stories. You know, I sat with a man who told me his story of having been an attorney, a successful attorney in Syria, who was defending some of the protesters, and it was not welcomed. His home was blown up. He lost relatives in the explosion. His daughter was injured. No one would help them. He literally threw her on his shoulder and walked for 3 days with her on his shoulder to get across the border to Amman, and turned out she had a cracked skull. He was able to get her health care until his dollars ran out, and then he was living on the street when he was found.
One last thing here, and this is important because you all and other agencies are trying to do this work. And you just told me before we started here, you don't have the funding you need. You all are so short. I would assume many other agencies are short as well. Why is there a gap, a void in getting the dollars you need to do your work on the ground?
I wish I had a great answer for that. You know, the American people are usually extremely generous, and we're hoping they will be again, because only about 8% of the funding has been raised. We're going to continue to work. UNICEF is going to be there on the ground. Millions of kids have been vaccinated. Hundreds of thousands are getting supported through this trauma by UNICEF. But significant dollars are needed.
Okay, but what is it? Is it too far? Are we too disconnected from the conflict? Has it been going on so long that there's a fatigue? I mean, like you said, you don't really know.
I'm sure some of it is donor fatigue, if you will, but I think it is easier in the United States to go about your business every day and not have to focus on what's going on there. But having been there, I can only say there but for the grace of God, because these are people living lives like mine until this started.
Well, thank you again, Carol Stern, president of the U.S. Fund for UNICEF. We appreciate you. We try to keep this story to the forefront, but when you see those kids and how many have been affected, 5.5 million kids affected right now. Thank you so much. We're going to give a lot of folks, you want to try to find a way to help. If you'd like to make a donation to UNICEF, you can visit their website. You see it up there on the screen, unicefusa.org/Syria. Also a phone number, 1-800-4KIDS. You can also text the word Syria to the number you see, 864-233. That will get you a donation of $10. Again, Carol, thank you so much.